Just one more chapter. Something that I often said as a kid, and something that I actually still end up doing as an adult. When you get into a great book, it's really hard to put it down. And Horror Mayhem was definitely a month when I end up doing that because I enjoy reading horror stories and ghost stories. I find I can get into them. It's a great brain break from the everyday when so many other things are going on. So this fell at the perfect time. I did get a jump start on it because I wanted to revisit a few books that I've had for a number of years and I've read them a number of times. This is a series from Scholastic, and they're all they're all written by Pat Hancock. We have Haunted Canada, True Ghost Stories, Haunted Canada 2, True Tales of Terror, and Haunted Canada 3, More True Ghost Stories. Now, these were all published in 2003, 2005, and 2007. So a few years in between the publications. And this time, as I read through, I've tabbed all the different stories. Some of the stories are from my area, which I enjoyed reading and learning about different locations close by. But these cover the entire country, so it's also fascinating to learn about other locations as well as the ghost stories attached to those locations. I wanted to revisit those because if you've seen some of my recent book hauls, I found Haunted Canada, the second terrifying collection, and this is by Joel A. Sutherland. Now, this is book 4, 5, and 6, which was neat. And unlike Pat Hancock, his books were published one year after the other. So in 2014, 2015, and 2016. So it was, again, interesting to find more locations. I haven't gotten very far into it, but I am, again, tabbing where do the stories take place. So we have one that's at a bed and breakfast, another in an abandoned mental hospital. So many different things and so many different stories. Now I know why I have Rebecca Lute's name here. This also came up in another collection that I read. This is from Moncton, New Brunswick, and it has to do with a young girl. She was only 16 years old. There were different things happening in the community. It was 1876. Of course, people were looking for someone to blame, and sadly, they killed this young girl based on just a bunch of nonsense. And that story really stood out for me because it was so sad that this family, Lutz, had moved into this area thinking they would have a fresh start, and sadly what happened is their daughter ended up being killed by the rest of the village because, well, like I say, they were looking for someone to blame for things that were happening that she had nothing to do with. And I did come across that story in one of my other ghost books as well. So that's something else that I'm doing as I'm reading these books because I have a variety of compilations. I have some by Barbara Smith. I have some by John Robert Colombo. It's fascinating to read those because they were doing those in the 1900s. So to gather the stories, they were writing letters, having telephone conversations, not quite the same as now when people are getting emails or doing Zoom conferences or StreamYard, etc. So that's another interesting part to these stories is it isn't just the ghost stories. There are so many other historical bits that go with it. So I enjoy reading that type of thing. I do wish sometimes there was a bit more of a conclusion or more information, whether those hauntings are still happening or not, but that's the nature of the true ghost stories. Another revisit that I did was Carmilla. And I've noticed that there are some people who really didn't enjoy the read. This is a novella, so it's quite short, easy to finish in an afternoon or evening. I personally enjoyed it. It's set in Austria. I was fascinated to find out that this was written decades before Dracula. This is written by Sheridan Le Fanu. Interestingly enough, a name that to me sounds French, but he was born in Ireland. He was Irish. I enjoyed the story. It was very racy for the era that it was written in, because there's the implication that there's a love affair between two women, not something that would have been a common occurrence in that time period. But he doesn't come out and outright say it, it's implied. So it's up to the reader to decide what is this relationship between the young woman and Carmilla. What I didn't find reading it the second time, and I was going through it very carefully this time, is who this mother figure is that is with Carmilla prior to her being left in not one but two different homes. This woman comes up at a costume ball and things happen, and she asks to leave her daughter with this gentleman who's a friend of our main character's father, and she has to leave on some urgent situation. Then a few months later, they end up at this other home. There's an accident. Our main character's father offers to keep Carmilla at his home because there's no hospital or village close by where she could leave her. And the woman thanks him, says not to ask about Carmilla's past or anything like that. She has some urgent business to take care of, and so she'll be back in a few months to get her. But again, throughout the book, we don't find out who this woman is. We find answers about Carmilla. We find out about the abandoned village that's down from this castle or schloss, as it's referred to. The line, and I've highlighted it, and I have mentioned, yes, I am one of those people who writes and leaves notes in my book along with dog-earing them and sticky notes. But this line definitely got me. 800 or 900 a year does wonders. If that doesn't tell you how old this book is, I don't know what would, because anyone surviving on $800 or $900 a year is definitely not living in Canada. So again, reading something like this, it's a different time period, it's an entirely different world. As I say, it's set in Austria. There's a lot of different things to this. I personally enjoyed it. It was a fun read. It's a short read. It also, when he explains how people become vampires or why, again, tells you about the time period that it was written in. And at least she doesn't twinkle. I'm just putting that out there. No, sorry, I'm not a Twilight fan, but I am a Carmilla fan. Another book that I started was Horror Short Stories, and this is edited by Joanne Blythe. The first two were by Edgar Allan Poe, The Pit and the Pendulum, which is a story that keeps you going right until the end, and I very much enjoyed. The second story is Bernice, and it didn't have that same oomph to it because I'll have to read it again, as I mentioned in an earlier video, to go through what it was about. So I'm not sure that one wasn't a got you kind of story, because I've also read The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, and I don't need to read it again to know exactly what happened and the oomph that happened in that story. So, like I say, I'll have to revisit Bernice to comment a bit more on what that would be about. So, I didn't end up starting my huge Edgar Allan Poe collection, but I did end up reading two Edgar Allan Poe stories, so it kind of counts. The other two stories that I read in this collection were by H.P. Lovecraft. The first was The Haunter of the Dark. I really enjoyed that story. As I was halfway through it, I thought, this sounds really familiar. I've either read a story like it or I've read this. And then I went and looked at my H.P. Lovecraft compendium, and sure enough, there was The Haunter of the Dark. So I just read it a few months ago. I enjoyed it. It's got the element of mystery, you know something's coming, but it also has the message of sometimes if people tell you to stay out of a building or it's blocked off, there's a reason for that, and maybe you should just leave it alone. So there's that element as well of it's not only dark and mysterious, but there's an underlying message overall to it as well. The next story that I read was Dagon, and that was also in my little H.P. Lovecraft compendium. Dagon reminds me of Doctor Strange, as did Cthulhu and not the Dunwich Horror, but the Dunwich Horror I had read as a teenager a long time ago, and that was the only H.P. Lovecraft that I ever ended up reading. I'm not sure, maybe my library, because I grew up in a small town, maybe they didn't have a lot of Lovecraft, but he just wasn't an author that I'd read much of before. So now, in 2024, is really the first I've gotten into his works. I enjoyed, but like I say, I enjoyed The Haunter of the Dark and Dagon. It it keeps you going. They're definitely not light, happy stories. I don't think Lovecraft would ever have been considered that type of an author. And I actually ended up reading him because of an amazing episode I saw on Prime, a biography about him. He's an interesting individual. He certainly was opinionated about a variety of things, but it was after watching that biography about him that I decided to read some of his works because it also mentioned about Cthulhu, who I have been somewhere else, obviously, wasn't aware of any of this stuff. But like I say, his work did remind me of Doctor Strange and Marvel. So it makes you wonder whether Stan Lee and others had been reading Lovecraft and that's where some of their ideas came from. I've been noticing more and more, particularly this year, that as I'm reading things, I'm making connections to either other books that I've read, other authors, different movies I've seen, and then wondering, oh, I wonder if, this author or screenwriter read this and that's where they came up and tweaked the different ideas. So that's been fascinating because, as I say, I mean, I believe we're all connected, everything's connected, and maybe that's why more and more of these works I'm finding, oh, this author had that, this is where that came from, type of thing. And I find that fascinating. The final book that I ended up reading for Horror Mayhem was Haunted Schools, Ghost Stories, and Strange Tales. Now, I love in the beginning of this book, the author, A.S. Mott, talks about urban legends. And she's relating it to, and she compiled a list of 200 schools that she started looking into and then narrowed down the list for the stories she was going to share. But she brings up urban legends because when you're looking into ghost stories, whether it's to write a book or you're researching or looking into the paranormal, Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between what is a story based on real events and what was just made up to maybe, whether it's a publicity stunt or outright hoaxers, that type of thing. So she talks about how she had to narrow things down and that some of the stories were clearly just urban legends, so those aren't included in the book. She narrowed it down to the stories that she figured had some type of basis in a situation or event that occurred. The schools that she mentions are in Canada and the United States, so there's a nice mix between the two. And like the other ghost book, I did start tabbing them because I want to start putting together a project about different ghost stories and areas and that type of thing, because I very much enjoy reading them and learning more about them. Because not only do you learn about the ghosts and the stories, but as I said with the Haunted Canada books, you also learn about other locations, you learn about the history of areas. There's so much more to them than just a ghost story. And they're a nice, quick, easy read. The stories are usually just 2 to 5 pages long each, so if you're looking for something to just read in the evening, that type of thing, and you don't get freaked out, which I don't, then they're a nice, easy read, something to just pick up and chill out for a little while. Those are the only books that I got into reading during Horror Mayhem, partly because I was focused on trying to finish my Goodreads reading challenge goal, which did accomplish my 50 out of 50. So I'm well ahead of the game because I had until December to complete that. But I'm glad that I have that out of the way now because that's one less thing to factor in with my reading plans and goals. Two of the books that I didn't get to during Horror Mayhem. First was revisiting Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This will be going into my Rocket Summer pile as it does fall into the genre of science fiction. The last author that I didn't get to this Horror Mayhem is Michael McDowell. He's definitely one of my favorite authors. I read Cold Moon Over Babylon and The Amulet when I was a teenager, so, a week or two ago, and I very much enjoyed them. There are some people who may not enjoy his works because they're set in a different time period, they're set in the South. There's a lot of different things going on in the books, not just the horror elements, but the relationships between people and how they treat each other. I enjoy his work and the way that he writes. On the back, it's described as Southern Gothic horror, which it certainly is. As I say, I read him years ago, and I unhauled the books because I figured I'd read them. I recalled the stories. And then a while ago, I decided I wanted to read them again. I couldn't get them at my library, and it was not easy to find his works. I'm not sure why. He's an amazing author. But thankfully, my husband found this and The Amulet, so I am definitely hanging on to these copies and not unhauling them. On the back, it does say Cold Moon Over Babylon, so 1980. The second novel by Michael McDowell, author of Blackwater. Now, I had started reading that. Unfortunately, my library didn't have the last 2 volumes, so I have no idea how that series ended. And I've been looking to get that series to read it again because the library doesn't have it, unfortunately. And The Elementals, which thankfully my library does, so I'll definitely be borrowing that soon and reading it. This is also the screenwriter of Beetlejuice and The Nightmare Before Christmas. Now, if you've seen some of my videos when I've been taping in my living room, you know I'm a Jack Skellington fan. I have the Trivia Pursuit game of The Nightmare Before Christmas. I have a cup and a goblet of Jack. I love that movie. The graphics, the music, the story. It's phenomenal. And I was so excited to find out that Michael McDowell was the screenwriter of that. I had no idea until I read this back cover. So it's amazing how not only is he one of my favorite horror authors, but he's also the screenwriter of two of the movies that I very much enjoy. The cover art is by Mike Mignola, and there you go. Gives you a good idea of how creepy this novel is and gives you a few clues about what's coming up. It also mentions on the back that this is a first ever reprint. So I'm not sure what happened with his work or why it wouldn't have continued to be in publication. But if you like a creepy story, Michael McDowell is definitely an author to check out. That is my Horror Mayhem wrap-up. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of the authors that I've mentioned. Also be sure to give that like button a little tickle if you enjoy content of a bookish nature, if you enjoy nature videos or silly cats on Fridays. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you know when I upload content that may be of interest to you. Until next time, take good care.